So welcome everyone, whether you are joining us live for this webinar or whether you're listening at a later date, we are happy to have you with us. My name is Naomi Hoffer, and I'm the program manager for the Sheri Sobrato Brisson Brain Cancer Survivorship Program. And also in the background with me today are other members of our team, Alexa Greenstein, who's our nurse practitioner, and Mary Destree, who is our Marin Expansion Liaison Manager. So you might hear from them in the chat box or hear from them later in the show as well. So I'm delighted today that we are going to be focusing on balancing work and brain cancer. I know this is something that's of great importance to many people who have gone through treatment or who will be going through treatment and wondering how it's going to work to get back into their work lives and how they're going to navigate that. So this Living Well After Brain Cancer Treatment webinar series is part of our growing survivorship programming. So we also have other wellness classes, we have a neurocognitive clinic, we have peer support, and we have other activities designed to offer you a chance to meet one another and learn together and support each other. So today, I'm really delighted that we are going to be able to cover this topic with Nicole Jarvis, who is from Cancer and Careers. Nicole's going to be talking about deciding whether to work and how do you make that decision, as well as how do you decide whether to disclose your diagnosis to your employers and supervisors. And we'll talk about requesting accommodations, how that works. She'll offer us some job searching strategies. And then after Nicole gives her talk, we are going to hear from survivors themselves and hear how they managed to get back into the workforce after going through brain cancer treatment. So we'll hear from them, and then there's hopefully going to be a chance for you to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and you can submit questions to Nicole and to our survivors. And then after the Q&A segment, we're going to have an after the show community connection, which we are doing now to just offer you another chance to meet one another and share your experiences and learn together. So it's an unrecorded segment, it's an informal discussion. So I invite you to stay on afterwards if you would like, and I'll tell you how to do that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our main speaker for today, Nicole Jarvis. Nicole holds a Master's of Social Work degree and has worked in the child welfare arena advocating for parents in family court. Prior to joining Cancer and Careers, Nicole worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering for 4 years in the chemotherapy unit, as well as in renal oncology. She then joined Cancer and Careers team in 2015. As their senior manager, she oversees the website newsfeed, the blog, and the professional development microgrants program, as well as coordinates all the Cancer and Careers webinars and assists with the regional and national conferences. In addition, Nicole provides direct support and referrals to the many patients, survivors, and healthcare professionals who reach out to the organization. Nicole, thank you so much for guiding us through this topic today. Please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm really looking forward to having the chance to speak with you all. So as Naomi said, my name is Nicole. I am the Senior Program Manager at Cancer and Careers, and I'm also one of our in-house social workers. And I do also want to just note that this presentation does contain a ton of information, much of which is on the slides. I will be speaking to a lot of it tonight, but there is also a good amount written out that's intended to be resources for the future. So don't feel too pressured to read along. I've also shared the PowerPoint presentation with Naomi, who will email you all a copy of that after the presentation tonight so that you can have your own copy as a resource for later on. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Cancer and Careers for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We were founded in 2001, and we are the only organization in the United States that's solely focused on working cancer issues. So we provide our support through a number of programs and resources that are always free of charge. Our website is our main hub for information on our programs and services, which include our publications, which are available in English and Spanish, and we will ship those anywhere in the US for free. You can also download them off of our website as well. We offer online career coaching and a resume review service, as well as educational webinars that take place throughout the year and are archived on our website for those who are unable to attend the live events. Other educational events include conferences. Typically, we hold them in person, but obviously this year is anything but typical. So we have shifted into the virtual landscape for a number of them, and likely we'll be doing that continuing into next year. So if you guys are interested in joining us for any of those, they will be much more accessible. So before we jump in, I do want to just take a moment to really acknowledge this constantly shifting landscape due to the pandemic and how it's impacting all of our lives in one way or another, both personally and certainly professionally. There are those that are still working from home or others who have recently returned to their workplaces, and others who have had to report to work throughout their pandemic. And unfortunately, as well, those that have lost employment or have had their hours significantly reduced. Additionally, I imagine that many of you are in different places in terms of your own cancer story and the things that you're thinking about. Some of you may have just received a diagnosis or may have already made decisions about working through treatment. Some of you may be squarely into survivorship, but dealing with some of those long-term side effects of treatment. And some may be looking for your first job ever. And of course, with everything that's going on with COVID-19, there's now a whole new layer to everything. But regardless of where you are today, I'm hopeful that you'll find some things that apply now and maybe some to take away with you as well. We're going to start today by thinking about the various tensions and challenges that come up after receiving a diagnosis. Specifically, when we start thinking about work and life and how everything is going to come together, it's important to recognize that a lot of questions start to crop up. And sometimes the answers to those questions are naturally in conflict with one another. So this leads us to two overarching questions that you can ask in order to start to illuminate the best path forward for you. First question is, how important is work to you personally? And then, what information do you actually need in order to make good decisions about work? Inevitably, this leads to a whole host of additional questions because, as we know, what we want is not always what we can do. So the question becomes, how do you find a path that's workable? Some additional questions to consider include, how will work affect your treatment and schedule, and vice versa? When talking with your healthcare team about that, it's going to be really important. You'll want to think about things like, when are your side effects likely to kick in? Some treatments cause people to feel unwell almost immediately. So in that case, if possible, you want to schedule your treatment for a Friday so you have a weekend to recover. Other treatment protocols, the effects might not kick in until a few days later, in which case scheduling the appointment for Wednesday might make more sense. So I encourage you to be proactive and ask for the times that work best for you. And of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what other things might you want to save your energy for? A new hobby or personal project, or maybe you're the one who does all the cooking and cleaning at home. The truth is that each of us has a limited pool of internal resources and energy that we divvy up into our own personal pie chart. And when cancer gets added to the mix, that pie gets smaller and smaller as treatment continues, and prioritizing becomes even more important. For many people, finances and insurance are tied to their jobs and are very important. So often those are the driving factors in determining whether to work during treatment or not. Or maybe for you they're important, but they're not the number one reason. Many people want to continue working because first and foremost, it's part of their identity. It's really who they are. Particularly in this country, where when we meet someone for the first time, we ask, what do you do? Not what's your favorite food, or have you read any good books lately? What we're basically asking one another is, how do you contribute to the world? Which is a pretty profound question. So for some people, finding out that their ability to work will be compromised can lead to a secondary crisis, an identity one. And in these cases, it can be really helpful to talk to your healthcare team, including a social worker, about ways in which you can take care of yourself emotionally if it does look like your capacity to work might become impacted by your diagnosis and treatment. So in an effort to answer these questions and make decisions, you're going to want to do a lot of information gathering. This slide illustrates the three buckets into which this information can be sorted. We've talked a little bit about the first one, which is medical and treatment information. But I want to reiterate that it's really important to share specific information with your healthcare team about what it is that you do for work. It's not enough to just tell them that I'm in sales or even I'm an administrator at a school. You'll need to provide details about your day-to-day routine and responsibilities so they have a really clear picture of what your energy levels might be needed to be. The next bucket is work information. You'll want to look into benefits you have, such as paid time off and health insurance, but also look into existing workplace policies, such as donated leaves. This information is typically found in your employee handbook or the initial paperwork that you sign when you get the job. And the third category is legal information. So as I mentioned, I am a social worker and not an attorney. So while I'm going to talk about the law, I'll do so in very general terms, but I really strongly encourage everyone who has specific questions about their situation to reach out to a legal professional. The law plays a very important role in thinking about and talking about working cancer, which is why I include it. Understandably, for some, it can seem scary to think about the law in our jobs, but I want to emphasize that the point of discussing this topic is not because I think it's likely that an employment situation will become litigious, but rather legal and practical issues don't exist in separate vacuums. Often when there is a practical concern, there's a legal piece to it as well. And for many people, the law becomes a very valuable tool for helping them to create a plan for working through treatment. So, as is obvious now, the law that we're going to talk about is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. This is often a key tool in navigating work after cancer. And the goal really in giving you a little background today on the ADA is so that you know that it's something that you should look further into based on your own situation. So to start, the ADA is a federal law, which means that it does apply in all 50 states. And the part that's relevant to working cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met to use it, which were part of that poll. So in broad strokes, the requirements are that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, and qualifications in order to do the job. And your disability must meet the criteria determined by the ADA. So in this case, most of you were correct in saying that it doesn't depend on the type of job. So if you meet all of these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and will also potentially provide access to reasonable accommodations, which I will circle back later on. Again, this is just a quick overview, so you know the ADA is something to consider. And it's also important to note that you may be further protected by a state fair employment law. So for example, New York's minimum is less than 15 employees. So it is worth looking into both the protections that are available through the ADA at your job and also understanding what state protections are available as well, as they can be a little bit more expansive sometimes. And once again, I do encourage you to speak with a legal professional to determine if you're eligible and to use the ADA's protections. So I really quickly want to talk about the online space. We often hear from survivors regarding the role that the internet's playing in helping them through cancer. For many, it can create a sense of community and a way to feel better in the moment. But we do just want to point out that it does create a written record of information. So research indicates that more employers and hiring managers are Googling employees and prospective candidates. And again, not to find something negative, but rather to find something further out about an employee or confirm something that they like about a candidate. But since there's a lot of information out there, it's important to know what your presence is online and to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so that you're able to make informed decisions about how your story is being presented online in the event that there is information regarding your cancer diagnosis that you've either shared or partaken in. So understanding the privacy policies of websites that you're using is really important because they are constantly changing, because Facebook and sites like it are designed to sell us things. So in order for them to keep making these new deals with advertisers, they do change their privacy policies very frequently and often without notice. So on the plus side, that is one of the reasons we don't have to pay for Facebook or Instagram, but it does make trying to keep up with these changes very impractical and very time consuming. So you want to think about the fact that even though you might be in a space where you've connected with people that you know and they've connected with you and you have some privacy settings, it's not a perfectly secure and structured system. So I just want to mention two alternative sites that can be useful. My Lifeline and Caring Bridge are social networking sites designed specifically to be a safe space to share updates about your cancer experience. They are more, excuse me, they are more controlled and have a higher level of privacy than the mainstream social media networks, but they are not automatically protected. So on the bottom of this slide, you'll see we have a link to our website where we have a guide to creating a more private profile on these sites. And again, you will have a copy of this presentation, so you'll have access to this slide as well. So if you're going to use these sites, it is worth taking the time to really read through privacy policies, figure out protections that are offered at each level of security, and figure out which one's going to work best for you. And really, in general, it's a good idea to review privacy policies for any website where you're going to be sharing any personal information about yourself. Some additional steps to take might include developing a personal disclosure plan to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey that you plan to share online and off, and where you might be sharing it in terms of social platforms or websites. And also thinking through what's going to work best for you. So thinking about the long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you have disclosed at your workplace and everyone's really supportive, which is fantastic. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away and none of us can really predict the future. So you might find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive boss may have moved on and been replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And really there's no way to know how that person's going to respond to the information they find. So it's important that once you've made these decisions about your disclosure online, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you're connected to online. And even if you have shared these preferences with your loved ones, it can be a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have an idea of what's out there, and just to make sure that they are respecting your wishes. There are plenty of opportunities to take control of what comes up about you in some of these searches that we've talked about by taking a strategic approach to what you post online. People don't know what you don't share with them. So in a work context, social media can actually be a place where you show people who you are as a professional. Social media sites that are listed here, like LinkedIn and Twitter, really rate highly on Google searches. So becoming active on these sites to represent who you are as a professional can really elevate your brand. I do want to just highlight that LinkedIn is a really great way to let people know if you have a new certification or you've written a blog about your industry or gotten promoted. And it's just a really strong tool to help you build up your online brand. And just keeping in mind that you can delete posts online that are no longer representative of your interests, but though they might be harder to find, they'll still be out there somewhere. So just being aware of what they might be. So going from the online space, we want to go back to the actual work environment to really talk about working through treatment. Here is some data to set the scene, which comes from our survey that we hold with Harris Poll every year or every other year. This one is from 2019, and you do see the top 5 reasons that survivors continue working after a diagnosis. So, you know, interestingly, this crowd was focused a little bit more on the income, which is obviously very, very important and is noted as being very important to many patients and survivors. But we did find it significant that 60% of survivors wanted to keep working because they felt productive, and also that work played a large role in helping them to feel normal, whatever normal was for them, and to feel productive and busy. And I do want to just point out that 75% of survey patients had also agreed that working during treatment helped them to cope during their cancer journey. So what this illustrates is the point that we discussed earlier, that work provides a sense of meaning and purpose, and also the act of working itself is beneficial for many people while they're going through treatment. And that's not to say that earning an income is solely just about the money. It's also about the independence it might give you, the ability to live the way you need to and want to as well. So there's always a plenty of different reasons why people want to continue working after a diagnosis. So it's always really important to keep that in mind, that there's no one size fits all plan for anybody. And it's really about getting to the heart of what you want and what's right for you. So when it comes to disclosing at work, like the rest of the decisions around sharing this news, it can be an incredibly personal decision and one that requires a lot of thought. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario, but just so we are clear and all on the same page, you are not required to provide information about your health or your health history to your employer, current or prospective, nor can they ask. So that said, there can be situations where you might have to share some information in order to access your rights under the law. And this doesn't mean sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or prognosis. It just means you might have to provide some support for why you're eligible to ask for whatever it is you're asking for. It might be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they technically had no idea that you had a condition to discriminate against. So as you're thinking through whether to share, it's important to consider all of the angles. Now, when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say, you can always say more later, but you can never say less. So if there is a need for you to divulge more information down the road, I encourage you to be prepared to do so, but just know that you don't have to offer it right away. Now, when deciding whether or not to share specific information about your cancer status at work, there are two major things to consider. One is, how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And two, what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? It's important to note that people may want to disclose for a variety of reasons. For example, personal communication style. Some people are born sharers. They couldn't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling others. And then there are those who are much more private and in fact feel very uncomfortable sharing personal information. So it's really about knowing yourself, and that however you feel about sharing is valid and should be taken into account. The individual culture of the workplace may also play a role. If you work at a small company where your colleagues feel like a second family and everyone chats about their weekends, kids, vacations, or perhaps you're at a big corporation where the environment is much more competitive and people typically are heads down, always working to get things done. Thinking about the various ways that people communicate with each other on the job may help you decide if, how, and how much of that information you want to share at work. You might also want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. And this doesn't necessarily mean cancer treatment, but perhaps a coworker went out on maternity leave or is caring for an aging parent. What kinds of flexibilities did the workplace provide for them, if any? And how was the news received, both by managers and other members of the team? Were people willing to step up and pitch in, or were they grumbling behind people's backs about having to take on the extra responsibilities? This can be incredibly valuable to consider these situations as you think about what you can expect out of your own experience if you do decide to share this information at work. It can also be smart to consider past performance reviews. For example, if you've been at a company for a long time and have always gotten really high performance reviews, but your medical team has now told you that fatigue could potentially be a side effect that you're going to experience, this might be something you want to share with your employer so there aren't any gaps in understanding if suddenly you're not meeting the same marks you once were. Because unfortunately, without context, it may simply look like a decline in performance. And if that goes into a performance review, it can have a long-lasting impact. We also get asked a lot about who should I tell? And with so much of this, it will vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. So if you do decide to tell, we recommend starting with whomever it will be easiest to talk to first. For many people, that's a direct supervisor because they're someone they can have an ongoing conversation with, and also someone who can be an advocate for them with some of the higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers were never formally trained to be managers. So in this case, it can put the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach that manager what to do next. So I do want to point out that we offer a publication called our Manager's Toolkit, and this is a packet that we put together that cancer patients and survivors can hand directly to their manager that sort of outlines how to best support their employee and really some of the laws that are available and some of the ways that you can work together to figure out how to make it all work. For other people, speaking with their supervisor, it may not be an option, so they might want to go to human resources instead, if their company has one. But perhaps the most important thing to convey in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment will be fluid. What you're sharing is what you know today, and that might not apply next month or 6 months from now. So getting it in their mind that this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation can set expectations correctly. So with all of that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in terms of a conversation at work is one that can be intimidating for a lot of survivors, and that's totally understandable. Here's a couple of examples of how you might start the conversation. But overall, when you're preparing to begin these conversations, just be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures that both your needs and their needs are being met. So I'll give you a moment just to read through one or two of these. So you'll also want to consider what side effects may say. So thinking about the reality of your physical self in the workplace and how you personally might manage the potential side effects of your treatment on the job. There's a wide array of possible side effects. So as we discussed earlier, you'll want to find out from your healthcare team which ones you are likely to experience and how those might be managed at work so you can feel comfortable and productive. It's also important to think about any potential visible physical side effects, especially if you choose or have chosen not to disclose any information at work. Because if your colleagues start to notice that you're losing weight or losing hair, or your energy has dropped and you don't seem like your usual self, they may start to ask questions. And typically these questions are coming from a place of kindness and concern, but they can certainly catch people off guard and create a situation where you might end up disclosing something that you hadn't intended on. So it's smart to spend some time planning out potential answers to some of those questions. And this is where social workers can be really helpful. And I also encourage people to utilize their social network as well to really go through some of these possibilities. And as we discuss side effects, there are certainly neurocognitive changes. Sometimes this is also referred to as chemo brain and brain fog. It's one that we get asked about frequently. This type of fog can come whether you receive chemotherapy or not, and it can depend on your specific diagnosis. But while there is no magic bullet solution, one piece of advice is really to let go of the idea of multitasking. Studies have shown that only 2% of people multitask effectively, and I think I can speak for myself when I say I am not part of that 2%. So to combat this, we recommend going back to basics. Write down a list of priorities, turning off phone or email notifications so they don't cause distractions, and focusing on one thing at a time. Writing everything down is a really good practice, so you always have a record and don't have to rely on your memory so much. Potentially keeping a single notebook with all of your to-do things in one place. It's much easier to keep track of that one notebook with the sticker on it so you don't wind up in a meeting with your grocery list instead of your talking points. It's also a good idea to take the time to rehearse everything from presentations, project updates, and even phone calls. If you work in an office type environment with a shared calendar, it can be a really good idea to block off some time for yourself so that people know that you're busy, so you can really focus on whatever it is you need to focus on. Some simple stress relief practices can also go a long way to helping you improve focus. Deep breathing exercises or 2 to 3 minutes of meditation can easily be done at a desk or while taking a walk. And it's really clear that a little bit can go a long way in terms of helping us hit the reset button when we need to refocus. So disclosure decisions will drive some of your strategy around how you communicate at work. One option is to identify a point person, and this may not be feasible in all environments, but in settings where it works, it can be an excellent solution. Someone who you trust and that's willing to be a centralized source of information about you, your health, and your schedule can also prevent you from having to constantly update everyone on how you're feeling. This person can also be your go-to about what's going on at work if you need to be away for a doctor's appointment or any other reason. It's also really important to be clear about priorities and have a good understanding of what your team is expecting from you and how you plan to deliver it. Whether or not you've disclosed, this is something that you should do in collaboration with your supervisor if possible. And then the final point is about limits, which can be a real challenge. This is a time when it's critical that you're honest with yourself about what you can and can't do at work, and that you also set fair boundaries and stick to them. Something to keep in mind here is that the way we articulate our needs in the workplace is going to be different than how we articulate those needs to a loved one. So the other piece is trying to figure out where our limits are and recognizing the signs before you reach that point so that you can recalibrate before it happens. What often helps with this is to rehearse what we call professional no's, and these are some examples on really how to know your limits and really set boundaries. So if someone offers you to work on a project with them, you can say, I appreciate that you thought of me for this project, but I am a bit swamped this week and I'm concerned about my ability to get this back to you in a timely manner. That's a totally legitimate response and is a really healthy way to set boundaries at work when you're just not up for whatever it is they're asking for. So as you make the return to work, one strategy is to use reasonable accommodations, which I had mentioned earlier is a benefit of the ADA if you qualify. Basically, these are tools that can be used to make working through treatment or returning to work after treatment much more manageable. It's much easier to think about how these might work with examples, which I've broken up into categories for you on the next couple of slides. But I do want to note that there is a ton of information available regarding what reasonable accommodations are, how to use them, and how they may be valuable for both you and your employer. We have a ton of this information on our website, but there is also a website, the Job Accommodation Network, that offers a lot of information as well. And again, you'll get these slides, so you'll have access to these links. So one type of accommodation that can be made is in the workspace, which means the actual environmental challenges that exist at work. So the best way to talk about some possible accommodations, as I mentioned, is to give an example. So we worked with a young woman who is a social worker. She was going through cancer treatment and work was incredibly important to her overall well-being and sense of self, which was something that she had expressed to her healthcare team. One of her side effects was nausea, which wasn't necessarily impossible to manage, but she began to note that it was exacerbated when she was at work to a degree that did become unmanageable. She realized it wasn't as bad at home after work or during the same hours on a weekend. So it seemed strange she was so sick at work specifically. So we zeroed in on that and through some conversations, realized that her office was next to the cafeteria, and that's what was making her nausea so bad. In this case, her accommodation was to change offices, which didn't mean that going through cancer treatment was a breeze by any means, but it certainly changed her ability to work, which for her was extremely critical. Another example is a gentleman who worked in the finance department, and one of his side effects was extreme fatigue. His role included a lot of printing, but for some inexplicable reason, the printers and scanners were located 2 floors below him, and the most direct way to get there was via the stairs. So he's going up and down the stairs all day long to retrieve documents, essentially walking extra miles. His fatigue clearly made this process more challenging. So for him, an accommodation was a printer at his desk. As you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all accommodation in an environmental way for every person. It's really about peeling away the layers of what's happening in your specific workspace, which can take some time to do, and then being creative about what the possible solutions might be. There's a number of questions to ask yourself to identify some other potential accommodations. So we have a lot listed up here, I know, so we'll just go through a few of them. One is, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? This means you're ultimately working the same number of hours, but they'd be distributed differently. So varying the start and end times of your workday to maximize the hours that you're feeling best could be a huge help. So perhaps you are someone who feels your absolute best early in the morning. So a 9 to 5 day could potentially become a 7 to 3 p.m. day. Or you could take some time during your workday to go to appointments and make that time up by working later that day or later in the week. Also, if your job includes break times, perhaps it's possible to take more frequent or additional breaks, and having those extra breaks could be a potential accommodation. Again, these are really just examples meant to help you start thinking about accommodations and to remove some of the myths around the concept, such as accommodations are expensive or unlikely to be approved. The fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, which I mentioned, most accommodations cost nothing at all or cost an employer $500 or less. So be resourceful, really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges you're experiencing. And remember that it is all fluid. So what would make work easier today might be different tomorrow. This isn't a one-time only opportunity, and it is possible to ask for more than one accommodation if that's necessary. So now let's move to returning to an existing job. This can present challenges, whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or more. There are pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape. You know the culture and quirks, you know your colleagues, and you know the responsibilities that are associated with your particular role. All of these things mean you won't have to spend time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment. Of course, there's also the con. There's the very sneaky and sometimes insidious before cancer picture. So it's wise to remind yourself that it's okay, and in fact, it's a good idea to ease back into the routine. Remind being the operative word, because this is often easier said than done. But it is a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind as you're returning. We frequently hear from patients that have a really real fear that they're going to be branded as the cancer person in their office forever. We've heard stories about colleagues making cancer-related comments to people who are returning to work, and typically these are well-intended attempts to connect with the person in some way, but they can feel pretty off-putting. So in these situations, we recommend a verbal technique that we call the swivel. It's a verbal formula or pattern that's used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by one of those well-intended colleagues. It involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic more work-oriented. I've listed a few examples here on this slide that you can read through at your leisure, but being able to shift the conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be really empowering and can indicate to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with a lot of professional contributions to make. Of course, there is a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace. Here are some additional examples of how you might use the swivel in order to respond to some of these well-intended but off-putting comments. So perhaps your boss says that you'd looked so exhausted recently that they didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate. A very good response could be that I appreciate your concern, but work's actually a key part of my overall well-being. And in fact, last night I had some ideas about the project I'd love to share with you. This is a really great way to really shift the conversation back to a place where you're comfortable and also back to you being a good employee. Unfortunately, there are those who make comments that are just outright insensitive, like the examples on this slide. What this really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond if someone were to make a comment like this, so that it's language that sounds like you. You could write it down and practice saying it out loud so the words feel comfortable coming out of your mouth. These are other areas where social workers can be really helpful for practicing these scenarios. Also, if you are in support groups or any other kind of supportive network, it can just be a good idea to practice some of this because it's really easy to get caught off guard and kind of fumble your words or get defensive. So this is a really great way to have a little bit more control over the situation. So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the job search. Here's some data from that 2019 survey that we did with Harris Poll. The first 3 data points are responses from patients and survivors looking for work. These are valid concerns given the 2 stats listed below, such as applicants who disclosed their cancer history did receive fewer callbacks from managers than those who did not disclose. The reason to share this information with you is not to scare you or to paint a negative picture, but it's really just so that you have this information in the back of your mind to make you the savviest candidate during your job search. We're also going to spend some time talking more about disclosure during the job search so that hopefully when you finish listening, you'll feel a little bit more empowered around this big piece of the puzzle. So it's no secret there are many challenges and unknowns when looking for a new job. It can feel scary and particularly challenging during this time. To start, remember looking for a job is a process that can take time. And while it might not feel that way right now, you should think about what you want and not just what you need. And then be really strategic about your approach. Job hunting comes with huge ups and downs, so it can be helpful to talk to a social worker about how you'll manage some of this emotional roller coaster effectively. We've also noticed over the years that people in the cancer community tend to hold themselves to a higher standard than others when looking for work. Very often, survivors feel obligated to share more of their health history than they have to or should. We like to say that job searching is like building any relationship. It's about timing with various steps involved. The process builds upon itself and can be heavily focused on a great first impression. We use dating as an example of relationship building. So the first phone conversation with a potential date is going to have a very different feel to it than a marriage proposal. So if someone shows up on a first date and is like an open book, sharing all of their idiosyncrasies and quirks immediately, that's going to read much differently than if that information comes up in 6 weeks or 6 months. So in the same way, you're not going to go on a job interview and admit you chew gum really loudly, or you always sign on to Zoom meetings a couple minutes late. So I encourage you to keep in mind it's important to behave appropriately in the context of which stage you're at in the job search process. And projecting appropriate confidence and control is a really great way to do so. And finally, during this time where so much can feel and is out of our control, there are some elements of job searching you can focus on right now. And they are completely within your control. Things like working on your resume, perfecting a cover letter, and getting into the habit of networking and embracing the new virtual way that everyone is connecting. And there's certain things that you should consider if you're doing a job search right now during COVID-19, because the practical questions like what companies are hiring and what jobs are available are important. You'll also want to try to find out about the safety measures and policies that employers are implementing and how important those are to you. This will likely be unique to your specific situation. So think about what you're comfortable with and what's safe, which should likely include conversations with your healthcare providers. According to one of our career coaches, currently more than 85% of jobs are found through other people versus through job boards or headhunters or ads. So it goes without saying that networking is a necessary part of the job hunting process. A lot of people tend to struggle with networking because it feels like they're asking for a favor. But the fact is, basically anyone you know can be a great resource for networking. LinkedIn has become the go-to source for employers looking to hire. And according to a recent study, 87% of recruiters reported that LinkedIn is the most effective tool when vetting during the job process. So it's a really good idea to use that as a great way to network and create new connections in order to broaden your horizons a little bit and pop up for those recruiters a little bit more often. So as important as LinkedIn and your overall online presence are for job searching, they don't replace the time-tested tools of job hunting, starting with the resume and cover letter. I'm not going to go through everything regarding what it takes to write a good resume. We do have a great resume review service, so if you're interested in utilizing that, it is free of charge, and it can be really helpful if you are concerned about gaps in your resume, or perhaps you're changing careers and you want to highlight something else. But just really remembering that you want to write your resume with the audience in mind. You want it to be succinct and future focused. And then with cover letters, you want it to be personal. You don't want it to be generic because you want to really stick out and you want to be able to sell yourself. So as I mentioned, disclosure is an important aspect to consider when it comes to the job search. A lot of people do ask if they should include their cancer experience in a resume or cover letter, either as a positive or an explanation of some sort. My first response is always do whatever you're comfortable with, but think of this. The goal of a cover letter and resume are to get you an interview based on your skills and potential. So in that sense, your diagnosis and treatment aren't really part of that conversation. And another thing that's important to consider is that if you disclose your diagnosis in a letter, it won't be a dynamic exchange, which means you won't physically be there when the employer initially absorbs that information. And then you won't have the opportunity to explain anything or answer any questions they may have, or more importantly, to steer them back to questions about your skills. So really thinking back to what I talked about in terms of job searching is like dating. No one tells everything about everything during a job interview, or even once they're hired. You want to really communicate appropriately for where you are in the process and do whatever feels right for you. But if you are 100% sure that you want to disclose during the hiring process, the cover letter and resume are not really the best way to do that. You just want to make sure that you let your employer know who you are as a professional before sharing anything about your cancer identity. And, you know, always remembering that you're never required to share this information. So this is a completely personal decision that you can make. So when asked about a resume gap, putting a positive spin on the situation can help greatly to put the recruiter or interviewer at ease. And it can also confirm that the gap doesn't have to do with a negative work ethic or laziness. Since it is possible and totally reasonable that you will be asked about a gap on your resume, it's a good idea to be prepared with answers. If it comes up, be future focused, non-specific, and brief. This slide has a couple of good examples of how you might use the swivel in an interview situation. But again, spend some time figuring out language that feels right and comfortable for you if someone does ask you about your resume gap. I do want to point out though that seeing as the times are what they are right now, resume gaps may become less and less of a red flag and something that's discussed since so many people are out of work and switching their jobs at this time. So again, thinking back to what the swivel is, you want your answer to acknowledge the question and then swivel the interviewer's attention back to the job in question, the desire to get hired, and the skill set that's on the table. Now, as we talked about some of the negatives of Google, there are some upsides, and that is that you can use it to research a prospective employer, and I encourage you to do so. You want to find out as much as you can about a company before you meet with them, and obviously knowing about the company is going to help you sound informed in the interview, but it can also be helpful to spend some time thinking about whether the company is going to be a good fit for your needs. If your interview is a result of having networked with someone on staff there, then you'll probably already have a sense of what it's like to work at the organization. But you'll still want to search for additional information. So in other words, you want to do some fact finding beyond the conversation that happens as part of the interview process. And here are the pros and cons of working in a new job with a new employer are different than the ones we talked about when returning to your existing role. One of the best things about starting a new job is that it's a fresh start. According to our career coaches, research shows that your first 90 days in a job are the make it or break it time for success. So this is the time when you're assimilating and managing your energy, meeting new people, learning the culture, and developing relationships. Reminding yourself that you don't need to work a million hours and that you should instead focus on creating a simple plan for the things that I just mentioned, and then break everything down into small pieces when it feels overwhelming. It's important for you to learn and understand what it means to be successful in your new company. And remember, every company is a bit dysfunctional. It's important to take care of yourself physically and mentally. And really remember, people don't get hired in the hopes that they'll fail. They get hired in the hopes that they'll succeed. So finding the right person for a job is time consuming and costly. So your new employer is going to want to do everything possible to make a success out of your employment. So really just keeping in mind that this is a challenging process and to be kind to yourself and give yourself the support that you need. And that's it in terms of content. I just wanted to throw out that we do have some other webinars coming up in the next month or so. And these are some links to our resources that I've mentioned, as well as additional resources for legal resources as well. And I will hand it over back to Naomi now.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was really chock full of really great information. And as Nicole mentioned, I am going to send these notes to you in a follow-up email. So you'll get all of the links and everything. And thanks, Mary, for putting the links in the chat box. So I'd now love to turn it over to our survivor panel for a more personal look at some of the areas that Nicole spoke of. Tolu and Rukshan. First of all, we're going to have Tolu Ladeinde. And I'd like to introduce her. Tolu, in addition to her 3 brain tumor surgeries and treatment, Tolu also had a long and painful battle with Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a rare and serious disorder of the skin and mucous membranes, which caused her to lose 100% of her skin. So she eventually recovered from Stevens-Johnson syndrome and continued her brain cancer treatment. And eventually she was well enough to go back to her teaching career, starting slowly back as a substitute teacher. So Tolu, thank you so much for being here. I'd love it if you could talk to us a little bit about your process of going back to work and finding your new limits when you went back.
Okay. So for me, before I had to go through all of that stuff, I was working in Russia. I was the kind of person who, if you said, can you do this? I'd be like, sure, yes. So I basically did a lot of things and was used to running around, and everything came to a stop with the seizures and then the, reaction to the medication, which led to Stevens-Johnson and all of that stuff. So going back to work, I was glad that I was, while I was still doing my chemo, I felt like I had to do something because I'd been home for, I think that was about 2 years being home, going through all of that. And I'm the kind that it's hard to just sit and do nothing, but get well, like sit and just let your body get well. So that's why I started doing substitute teaching. And the first thing that hit me as a surprise was even doing half days, just 3 hours. I was so tired at the end. I was so tired. And I realized like, wow, my maybe mentally I might think that I'm ready, but my body is telling me no. I cannot do as much as I did. I needed to take it slowly. So yeah, the first thing I had to learn, because even when I got back, now I'm actually teaching a class. It's not long. It's also like a 3-hour long class, ESL. And one thing I realized was when I was trying to do too much, I would start having small seizures. So that was kind of my ding, ding, ding. You can't do all these things. You can't say, yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do this, and run from one thing to another because your body can't take it. And I had to be okay with that. I had to be okay with the fact that, all right, I can do some things, but I have to set boundaries around myself. I cannot run all over the place anymore. So yeah, 2 lessons. Number 1, that I need to listen to my body. And number 2, that I need to be okay with that. It's not like I can't still talk. I'm a people person. You can still talk to people. You can still reach people. But just being okay with saying, no, I can't do it, because everyone's so used to saying, hey, Tolu, can you help me with this? Tolu, can you help me with that? And so I have to be okay with saying, sounds nice, but yeah, that's not happening. So those are the lessons I've learned.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, it sounds like it wasn't part of your personality to say no and set boundaries. So yeah, thank you. And now I'd like to also introduce another survivor, Rukshan Bhaisa. Before learning of her hemangiopericytoma, Rukshan experienced confusion, memory loss, and changes in her affect and emotions. As a result, she was let go by her employer. Only after her diagnosis did she seek out her managers to let them know that it was a brain tumor she was experiencing. With that new information, they reinstated her to her role. And once her treatment was complete and she was planning to return to office, she reached out to her HR representative to request ADA accommodations. Rukshan, thank you so much for being with us. Could you please say a little bit about what it was like for you to request ADA accommodations from your employer and how that since impacted your job?
Sure. Hi, everyone. The request process for ADA accommodations was actually through a third party, not my corporate entity, but they subcontract with other people to manage these ADA accommodations. And there was a lot of paperwork just like with any short-term disability request. And so I had I think it was the neuropsychologist help me figure out what accommodations I would like to request. And they were put into writing and then sent off to the subcontractor who was going to liaise, I guess, with HR to make it all legal and binding for the corporation. I requested things like extra time on projects, training. So I had been let go and then reinstated, and the quality of my work previous to me being let go had been pretty poor. And so that was definitely a factor in the accommodations. So it was more time, extra training, maybe more meetings with my manager, a flexible schedule at first. I think I sort of ramped up from maybe 20 hours to full time over, I don't know, maybe 4 to 6 weeks or so. I was lucky enough to have a good amount of energy by maybe 7 or 8 months after my surgery, that I found it actually, the part-time was sort of, it was harder to keep track of when I wasn't supposed to be working than just work sort of 9 to 5. And yeah, I was very lucky that my managers and everybody were so accommodating and were thrilled that I was better and ready to work and excited to work. And yeah, I felt really fortunate to have that experience.
That's great. And I know you were very generous in sharing your letter, your ADA request accommodation letter. Is it okay if we share it with viewers right now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks. You gave it to me to share, and I appreciate that. Here it is. So you said that you came up with this with the neuropsychologist at UCSF that helped you kind of devise.
Yeah,
13 points.
some of this was a neuropsychologist, and another was a family friend of mine who helped me just write out what my needs might be. I wrote this in July of last year, which was smack in the middle of my radiation treatments, and I had been planning to go back to work in October 1st, as this says, but I didn't actually go back to work until November, as I had, I extended it a month to feel a little bit better, a little extra better. But yeah, like point number 2 is I expect to regain full brain function within the next 12 to 18 months, but may experience difficulty with short-term memory, organization, and other executive functions. I took a big hit to my executive function, planning, organization. It was really hard for me when I went back to work to figure out what I was supposed to do on a daily basis. I mean, that's always when you start a new job, or new, as the case may be for me, and you don't necessarily know what you're supposed to be doing all day, every day, until you get the hang of things. And just trying to organize myself back to my job was a bit difficult, but I made it through help with the neuropsychologist and my colleagues. I would encourage everybody to go to a neuropsychologist after treatment. It was so superbly helpful. There's a great one at UCSF.
Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing this now. And I appreciate you so much. And Tolu, I'm going to bring you back to, if I could ask both of you, if you were to kind of give a bit of advice, you just gave some advice, Rukshan, but Tolu, you as well, advice to people going back to work, perhaps at the same job after treatment. What do you think what would be more important for them to know?
Take your time. Tolu is absolutely correct that, I too was a person was like, I can help you. I can, I can do this or that or whatever. I was like, I can't do any of that. I got to go home and rest.
Yeah.
So that, like, setting boundaries is important. Having trusted colleagues that you have confided some struggles in, I think is important as well. So you do have somebody to tell your news to.
Yeah, I'll say for me, because, oh, am I frozen?
No, you're good.
Okay. For me, I started a new job working after everything happened. And so I was still, not, I already knew that, number one, I had to take notes with everything because it's easy for me to forget information. And from the beginning, I told my boss that, yeah, this is something I've been going through. But they hired me. She knew from the beginning. And yes, what I said earlier, I'll say it's not like you can't do the job. You just have to be careful how much responsibility you take, because you can easily overdo it. You thinking you can do it, but your body telling you, no, it's not happening. I think that was just the biggest thing for me to learn. Just slowing everything down and not accepting more jobs. So.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. So for those of you listening, I want to encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A. And we do have, Nicole, I'm going to bring you back on. Thank you for joining. So Nicole, there's a question I have for you. Am I protected from getting fired due to my fatigue or forgetfulness? I know, Rukshan, you had mentioned this, that you did get fired before knowing it was brain cancer, but can you speak to that a little bit, Nicole?
So, first of all, Rukshan, your story was really, was great. Thank you so much for sharing it. And I think that it points out a lot of what was discussed in the presentation, just about how important disclosure can be, in the sense of, if they don't understand what's going on with you, it might be really challenging. It's all about context, right? And so while suffering from fatigue could come off as, a disinterest in your job, or laziness, or, maybe you're preoccupied, maybe you're looking for another job, they don't know without the context. And so, yes, you could get fired. So this is an important area where you want to think about your disclosure options, and what protections are available to you. So knowing that if you do disclose, you do have protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as cancer was added as a disability under that act. And so you would have protection in that regard. And then working with your employer to, figure out what's going to work for you. But knowing that without context, your employer isn't going to magically know what's going on with you. And so just really, really thinking about what the benefits to disclosing some of that information might be.
Great. And just a quick follow-up, Nicole, thank you so much. If you disclose, that doesn't mean you're disclosing to everybody, right? Like you can just, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. So you decide who you want to disclose to. That could be just your manager. That could be just your HR department. It depends on what your relationships are with work. As I mentioned, some people want a lot of people to know so that everyone's on the same page. But I think it also is important to know that even if you just tell your manager, having an understanding of what your manager's responsibility might be. Do they need to tell HR if they are going to be approving certain things for you, or time off, or anything like that? Because if they're asked about it, they might have to tell HR. So just really understanding what the dynamics are as you are making those decisions as well. A lot of things in the employee handbook can be really helpful in terms of, modes of communication and lines of communication in the workplace as well. So what the responsibilities around that are.
Yeah, got it. Thank you so much. And then for, I think, Tolu and Rukshan, did your coworkers, or do they treat you differently knowing your diagnosis? And if so, how do you deal with it? Do you want to take that?
I guess if I go first, All right. So for me, I was coming back to the US from another country. So those coworkers, they saw what happened. So I wasn't treated any different. They know who I am. My new coworkers, they also found out. And, but it's not something that they didn't treat me any differently. They treated me like normal. It's not like, yeah. So we talked together. I asked for advice. They asked for advice. So we work together as a team. So for the last few years, yeah, I have an experience. I'm a teacher, so we all need help. So we've all been talking to each other. So I haven't experienced any differences with my coworkers.
Got it. Thanks. How about you, Rukshan? Any difficulties?
In fact, it was my coworkers who noticed my decline first. As your coworkers are really the only people you're, usually accountable to in regular life. I mean, like if I forget to make dinner plans or something like that, like nobody thinks that like there's something really wrong. But when I start to not do my tasks that I've been doing for the last 3 years with no explanation, and that what you were saying was exactly right. My affect was so flat that I didn't look like I cared, and I didn't, because I had something pressing on my brain. And I was wholly unconcerned with everything. And it was very concerning to my coworkers who knew me from before, and my friends and family who also noticed. So, yeah, people don't treat me differently now. I don't think I act terribly differently. So and I had a good result with my surgery. So there's not a lot of like outward side effects to it. But yeah, I occasionally tell people back when, I came back, it was shocking to people that it was like, oh, that's what happened? Okay. But it's a small office. I work in a small office. And so word doesn't spread, and that was fine with me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. And Nicole, another question for someone looking for work now. You maybe had mentioned this a bit, but any thoughts about how to find a job that is really flexible, that can really work with their low energy levels?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think as we've probably all experienced in our jobs, what you are told you're going to be doing tends to be much different than what you end up being expected to do. So, obviously starting out by preparing yourself for what you feel you would be ready for. So, what are your energy levels? What do you feel prepared to do? What would be most realistic for you to keep up with? I really like the website Glassdoor. I don't know if people are familiar with that website, but that is a website where employees, current and former employees, are able to write reviews on companies. It's done anonymously, so they're very honest. And that can give you insight into what the company culture is, what the policies are, what the flexibilities are, what the time off policies are, and things like that, and really get to know, or at least get a sense of what it might be like to work there and how realistic it might be if you say, I'm going to need a flexible schedule. I need every other Thursday off, and things like that. And really just doing your research is what I would recommend. You never know what's going to work for you, but thinking about what your needs are can be really helpful as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to our panelists today. Nicole Jarvis from Cancer and Careers, and Rukshan, Bhaisa, and Tolu, Ladeinde. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your expertise. It was really, really helpful. For those of you that are viewing this, for those of you who registered, you will be getting an email from me with the PDF of all the slides that Nicole shared, as well as the example that Rukshan shared. And the recording of this webinar will be available in about 1 or 2 weeks. So So thank you again for joining us. Take good care, all of you, and we hope to see you again.